Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, we're going to actually take a quick poll. All right, here we go. All right, so when you can, go ahead and answer the question on the screen, which is, what's the legality of cannabis in your country or state? All right, and we're going to wrap up this poll in a few seconds. So if you haven't already, go ahead and submit. Awesome. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and close the poll. Don't worry, we'll have more throughout. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Stacey Ajum, and I'm the marketing manager here at Siegel Scientific. We're so happy you all could join us for our webinar, Cannabis and Compliance, Navigating the Shifting Regulatory Landscape. Our first host for today is Elizabeth Sinclair, who is the Director of Marketing here at Siegel Scientific. And Elizabeth chairs the Cannabis Work Group for AIM, the Global Association for Auto ID. And our second host for today is Stephen Pelletier, who is a marketing manager here at Siegel Scientific, and he'll be showing us how to create a label in BarTender software. So before we get started, I do want to let you all know that this session is being recorded and all participants are on mute. If you don't feel comfortable attending, please log off at this time and we'll be sure to send out a recording to all of the registrants after the webinar. Also, if you haven't figured it out already, we do have a questions pane or a place where you can submit your questions because we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So please submit your questions. And if we don't get a chance to answer your question during the presentation, no worries, because we'll go ahead and follow up with you via email. Again, friendly reminder that all participants are on mute, but you should be able to hear us. So if you can't hear us, go ahead and check your audio settings within GoToWebinar. And if for some reason you still can't hear us, go ahead and hop over to GoToWebinar's support site. So, and with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Elizabeth.
Hello, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Sinclair, and I'm really happy to be with you this morning. As you know, in my day job, I'm the Director of Marketing for BarTender. But as Stacey said, I also chair the Cannabis Work Group of the Global Auto ID Association, AIM. Our work group spends a lot of time listening to industry experts, trying to navigate the unpredictable regulatory landscape of this industry, but especially thinking about ways we can help this burgeoning segment with traceability and labeling. I learn something new about the industry every day, and I hope that what you learned today is helpful to you. BarTender is uniquely suited to the needs of the cannabis industry, from growers who use RFID to keep track of their stock, to retailers who have to meet regulatory standards for their labeling, and every phase in between. A little later, my colleague Stephen Pelletier is going to show you some of the features that are built into BarTender that can really help every facet of the cannabis industry uncover new efficiencies and save time and money, as well as achieve regulatory compliance. So, you're probably wondering what you're looking at. This is the GS1 Canada booth at last February's GS1 Global Forum. It was held in Brussels. Each GS1 member organization had the opportunity to showcase its best work in the exhibit hall, and GS1 Canada chose to feature its cannabis seed to sale efforts. And this is significant because Canada was the second country to federally legalize cannabis. When they legalized, the only other country that had legalized cannabis federally was Uruguay. So I just want to say that as a marketing wonk, my heart was warmed by the simple elegance of this booth. Their in-booth giveaway was individually wrapped brownies, and I don't know if you can see the writing on the sign, but it says brownies do not contain cannabis. I mean, as if. And the GS1 employees manning the booth wore red buffalo check shirts, which I think you can see in the upper right corner of that one slide image. And as a person who's 3/4 Canadian, I can happily attest that this is among the most Canadian things ever. GS1 was confident in talking about cannabis because the industry is federally regulated there. The rules are the same across all provinces. In fact, you can even order cannabis online through the government website. So very few countries have this today. As I mentioned, Canada and Uruguay, and now we've added South Africa and Georgia to federally legislated adult use cannabis. In the US, as in many jurisdictions, we have confusing state-to-state regulations and requirements, for now anyway, because the public is becoming cannabis savvy. There's less giggling and more mainstream conversation. The tide is turning. Recent data from Pew Research show that among Americans born after 1945, there is overwhelming sentiment for legalizing cannabis. Stacy, who is our host on this call, manages our social media among a host of other things she does. And she's tried to position me as a cannabis subject matter expert in social media. I decline that. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but what I really understand is traceability. And the lessons the AIDC industry has learned helping industries like pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing, chemicals, aerospace, and retail are really going to help here. The largest cannabis conference in the world is MJBizCon, which is normally held in Las Vegas in December. There wasn't an in-person event as in most events in 2020. By the way, I just got their newsletter yesterday. It's called the MJBizCon Buzz, which I thought was amusing. The last time this show was held, I attended, and was 2019, and they saw something like a 20% leap in attendance. But in talking with the exhibitors, they felt like the 2019 conference was a little less organic, a little more corporate. And that's because big companies are starting to make plans and inroads. And so the industry is transitioning from that small counterculture-ish business vibe to more big business. And it's worth noting that the Altria, the tobacco manufacturer, Brinks, Modelo Beverages, and there are two other large corporate Fortune 500 players have formed a consortium that's now lobbying the U.S. government and working on the federal legislation. More on that later. But in the meantime, there's a lot of confusion about traceability and the technology that enables it. A lot of things happened around our November 2020 elections, so you may have missed this. As of Election Day 2020, November 3, we now still have a crazy patchwork of inconsistent regulation in the US. There are 18 states fully legalized for adult use cannabis. Interesting that those 18 states include 40% of the US population. One thing to remember about the cannabis market is that there's money to be made. And this crazy patchwork of rules is not conducive to interstate commerce. I'm reminded of how US federal regulation is often initiated in California before being adopted federally. This is because businesses have a hard time shifting their processes to meet individual state regulations. It's just more efficient and less expensive to follow one set of rules. So companies generally choose to meet the most stringent set of regulations that they're going to have to comply with. We also see this in Europe. This is mitigated a bit by the creation of the EU. It seems to be just a matter of time before we follow the lead of our neighbors to the north, and actually our neighbors to the south too. Mexico has rolled out legalized cannabis. It's not completely rolled out as far as I'm concerned, but Mexico will be federally fully legalized for adult use. So the interesting thing here is at the end of March, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said to expect a bill to federally legalize cannabis to be introduced on the Senate floor imminently. So what does the cannabis market look like today? We've got 18 states fully legalized, 35 for medical. In 2018, the sales of cannabis were $52 billion US dollars. Interesting that 87% of those sales were illegal. This is something that's happened, that's been an eye-opener in the Canada cannabis market. They expected that once cannabis, you could get it from the government and it was safe and legal to buy, that there would be just a minuscule amount of sales going on the black market. But as it turns out, this figure remains consistent in Canada as well. Even with federal legislation, 87% of sales end up ish, that's an estimate, are on the black market, which has really sort of turned the heads of investors and planners about how this is going to work. People speculate that's for a lot of reasons. It could be people trust their guy, or it could be people are trying to avoid taxes, or it could be people don't trust the government. Here's a really interesting statistics to me is that the 2018 US capital investment was 2 times the amount in that if you add the amount invested in 2015, 2016, and 2017. So let's take a look at the global regulatory landscape. You can see both medicinal and adult use spreading worldwide. And I think this map is outdated, actually. Mexico and the UK are on their way to being fully legal. There are rumors that it's legal to grow your own in North Korea. I don't know how we're ever going to find out whether that's true or not. And New Zealand actually rejected a ballot measure to fully legalize last September. Back in 2013, when we first started considering promoting BarTender for the cannabis market, one of the internal objections was that it would only be received well in the US, and as a global company, we couldn't take the risk of alienating other markets. I think that's changed. Late last year, the UN took cannabis off the narcotics schedule, as did the EU, a first step to legalization. So let's delve in a little deeper. So CBD is the acronym for cannabidiol. It is one of several naturally occurring cannabinoids. Among the claimed medicinal benefits of CBD are reduced neuropathic pain, reduced inflammation, and improvements in depression and anxiety. The other cannabinoid you've probably heard of, there are many others we're actually just starting to learn about, is Tetrahydrocanna Cannabidiol, that's a mouthful, or THC. And people like to say that the difference between the two is that THC is psychoactive and CBD is not, and that's not true. If CBD in fact impacts levels of depression and anxiety, it too is psychoactive. It affects the brain. A more accurate way to describe the difference is that THC is intoxicating, CBD is not. Both CBD and THC can be derived from the cannabis sativa and indica plants. These strains also provide the leaves that people smoke, weed. But there's another cannabis source of CBD, and that's hemp. Hemp has been cultivated for centuries, and in the US until 1937, when the Marijuana Tax Act came into effect, making it illegal to grow. But the 2018 Farm Act moved hemp off of the federally controlled substances list and opened the door for legal industrial hemp production in the US. Hemp is now the chief source of CBD in North America. Legal cultivated industrial hemp must contain less than 0.3% of THC. So what's interesting here is that partners have shared stories with me of customers who are farmers in the US Midwest and in the Canadian Prairie who have plowed under their existing crops to be part of this first big wave of hemp farmers. Thousands and thousands of acres and looking to the auto ID industry for help. This has actually created a significant new need for supply chain technologies. And hemp is a great multi-purpose plant. Of course, you can extract CBD oil from it, but the seeds are chock full of protein and the fibers are very strong. You can make rope, clothing, and new trend alert, you can even make building materials. People say that the US is poised for a boom in homes made from hempcrete, which is a great insulator and moisture regulator. We'll talk a little bit about exactly how big a deal CBD is going to be in consumer packaged goods in just a minute. So, Cbd market environments. There are a lot of sources for industry data. Most show similar trajectories for growth in this market, and it's a steep curve, but with varied supporting numbers. It's my opinion that the Brightfield Group is a reliable source of data. You can find their reports online. I cite data here from their 2019 CBD market report. We're looking at massive growth. In the US, CBD sales grew 562% in 2019 to $4 billion. And we expect that to be $24.4 billion by 2023. Verticals, if you attend the supply side conference, you know the market. Cosmetics and food make up over half of the market for CBD in the US. The pharma and nutraceutical segments, though, are growing fastest. And expect explosive growth here as more double-blind human studies and top-level scientific research is being done on the physical effects of CBD, and it becomes more acceptable as a therapeutic ingredient. CVS, Walgreens, your neighborhood drugstore and grocery have been a significant part of this growth. Before 2019, most people got their CBD online or in those states with legal retail here from your local cannabis store. The entry of large corporate, familiar, and big box retail chains has really helped overcome the barrier of product education and awareness, opening up new swaths of consumers to the industry. These mass retailers only entered the market in 2019, and by the end of that year, they owned 57% of the sales. So CBD is not niche anymore. It's normalized, not exotic, and counterculture. You know, how many of you have heard stories or have stories about grandma who's suddenly mobile and in less pain attributed to the use of CBD cream? If grandma's using a product, it's mainstream. And again, with the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill, there was an explosion of CBD brands in the US market. It's now over 3,500. The top 10 companies hold about 29% of the market, but there's an increasing disruption from well-funded startups who are looking to capture a segment of this lucrative and growing industry. We've even reached the point where companies are starting to market with a goal of brand recognition, which begs the question to my mind, who's going to win and be the Coca-Cola of cannabis? The market, though, is fragmented. 1% of CBD brand owners are considered top tier, either owning sales of better than 40 million or sold in greater than 1,000 stores, while 92.9%, so 93% of companies had sales of less than 1 million or are sold in fewer than 100 stores. CBD oil processing is growing at an enormous rate, but we're actually starting to see the number of CBD oil processors contract. A lot of small players are getting swallowed up or giving up because the competition is difficult with all the money that's being infused by larger companies. It reminds me a great deal of the palm oil processing industry, where rates of production continue to increase, but through merger and acquisition, we're now left with only a handful of processors globally. Some experts expect a similar competitive landscape in CBD oil. So, as we've discussed, because cannabis isn't federally legalized here in the US, we have a patchwork of CBD regulations that differ from state to state. As we've also discussed, this makes interstate commerce a challenge and creates confusion. In 2019, FDA sought public input on how they should proceed. FDA has not yet bestowed generally recognized as safe for use in humans or animal food on CBD. This is a big hurdle, and it's a big first step to FDA becoming more comfortable with the industry. Good manufacturing processes, or GMP or CGMP, is another important designation, and here's where things are going to be held up a little bit. Last year, FDA randomly tested 200 products available on the online market: tinctures, oils, capsules, edibles, drinks, both for humans and for animals. There were vast numbers of labeling errors. Half of those items contained undeclared THC, which might explain why grandma was feeling so good. 20 of the tested products listed CBD as a percentage or by weight. 1/4 of those products contained less than 80% of the amount indicated, while 30% of tested products contained more than 120% of the amount declared on the label. This is a problem. So we don't have data on the cost of labeling errors in the cannabis industry yet, but we do for the food industry, and we anticipate that they would be parallel. So labeling errors account for about 50% of food recalls in the US. The average cost of a recall to a company, large or small, is $10 million, and over half of companies go out of business within 3 years of a recall. Again, we anticipate these data will be similar for the cannabis industry once it's FDA regulated. Currently, CBD cannot be marketed as a dietary supplement, and until it achieves generally recognized as safe status, it can't be added to food and beverages. But in states with legal retail cannabis, you can buy CBD food and drinks in those retail outlets, but again, not at Walgreens, CVS, or Kroger, at the pot shop down the street. I can tell you, though, this is going to change. In my career, I've worked with a lot of CPG and food manufacturing companies whose names you'd recognize. In my present job, I work with them to help enable supply chain efficiencies. In my past job, my company helped with manufacturing and formulation. Virtually every large CPG food manufacturer in the US has formulated drinks and snacks that include CBD. They're done, prototyped, tested, and ready to be marketed once FDA gives the green light and executive teams are ready. There are millions and millions of dollars in development, and CBD in CPGs is going to be a big deal. So I think this slide says it right here. This is a nice recap of what we've discussed so far. We can expect increasing standardization and alignment, and that's not just federally in the US, that's globally. An interesting fact is that when Oregon and Washington were the first states to make cannabis legal for adult use, virtually every other state followed the roadmap and perfected and added nuances to what these two states had established as traceability and labeling regulations. And in fact, Canada also worked very closely with Colorado and didn't clone their labeling regulations, but certainly helped with alignment there. Every state where legalized has seed to sale traceability written into law. Inventory management software is required by law in most states. Just to add, while we can't expect identical regulation globally, we certainly can expect harmonization, as already evidenced by, Canada trying to align well with the US's efforts. So, how do we enable the seed to sale traceability, and why is it important? Well, why it's important is easy. Cannabis is a high value item and is consumed by humans. So there's danger of counterfeiting, theft, and black market activity. More significantly, there's a risk of human health. Growers, processors, retailers, regulators, and consumers have a vested interest in following individual plants, lots, packages, and products as they travel through the supply chain. Laws say retail labels require a barcode. Every jurisdiction requires end-to-end traceability, but as this market becomes more tech savvy, we're seeing a shift in interest. They're starting to deploy RFID. The hemp and oil processing segments have already largely transitioned to RFID lot tracking. The advantages to RFID in this industry are the same as the other industries we serve. It provides transparency in the supply chain, real-time visibility in data, and accurate inventory, which is very important in this industry for taxes and regulatory compliance, as well as asset management. You probably weren't surprised to hear that testing of leaf cannabis often reveals that it is mislabeled for strain and potency. Or maybe you were. I guess I was a little surprised. RFID-enabled traceability can really help mitigate this. RFID enables more rapid tracking in the greenhouse, better quality management, and in turn, increased consumer confidence. So these rules are not standard across all jurisdictions, but they're somewhat consistent. Marijuana and hemp items can't be packaged in a manner that's attractive to minors. There will never be a cannabis equivalent of Joe Camel. No cartoon characters. There are limitations on font size. They have to be a certain size and for legibility. All required information must be visible on the outside of the package. So you're not going to have to open up the package to find out about potency or use dates. Barcodes can only be displayed one time. They must be rectangular in shape. And I don't know if you've seen the cute barcodes that that actually scan beautifully, that are, they're little plants or they're little animals. They're very clever. None of that on cannabis packages. So this label is going to be different with each regulatory body that mandates label formatting, but in a nuanced way. When Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize, they created, if you will, the regulatory template that other geographies have adopted. So this is somewhat consistent across geographies. Here's a fun fact. Washington was the first to require state approval of packaging, and that was controversial enough that in 2014, the New York Times featured an article that focused on the First Amendment implications. Now this state approval of labeling is just considered standard practice. And so because we can't sell state to state, there needs to be a certain amount of variable data on the label. So these are called universal symbols, which is kind of an ironic title because they vary state to state. They're not universal, but these are easily recognized icons that will tell regulators, consumers, and retailers whether their product is approved for sale in their state. And now that we have 18 legal adult use states, we have 18 icons. So what are our keys to growth here? As consumers become more familiar with CBD brands, buying them from retail outlets they've trusted over the years, learning more about products, claims, and results, and hearing about it from friends, even grandma, the market will grow. We have a patchwork of regulations in the US, but it's really just a matter of time before CBD and cannabis legislation passes nationally. The commercial and tax potential is just too great. And now public appetite and legislative sponsorship are finally in place. Once regulation is in place and there's better science about CBD in the human body, more rigor around formulation, testing, and labeling in the industry. FDA will step in and we'll see regulation. And finally, systems and business interoperability is essential. Auto ID is going to save the day here. We don't have time to discuss in depth is that to truly enable traceability in this very complex and highly regulated supply chain, every business will have to speak the same language, use the same standards for data taxonomy and syntax. I encourage everyone to visit the GS1 website to learn about the interesting work they're doing in this regard, because it's really providing global direction. And now, Stephen's going to show you how to build a retail label with BarTender. You're going to see ways that BarTender can help the industry find new process efficiencies, save time, money, and resources. But first, a poll from Stacy.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth, so much. Yeah, so quick poll. I'm curious to see the answers. And the question is, how does your business serve the cannabis industry? Are you a grower, processor, retailer, technology provider, or something else? All right, and we're gonna have this poll go for a few more seconds. So go ahead and submit. Awesome. Okay. All right, we're going to close this poll up, and at the end, we're going to check back in and see the results. But I'm going to pass this off to Stephen so we can go ahead and learn how to make a label in BarTender.
Thank you, Stacy. Can everybody see the screen?
Not yet. Let me go
Okay.
ahead and get that going for you.
How about
Awesome.
now?
Yeah, now we can.
All right. Thanks, Stacy. So my name is Stephen Pelletier, and what you're seeing here is actually a completed simulated label run for a retail product, edible label, a cannabis edible label. On a specialized stock, it's 4x7 with a split right here. So as you're looking at this, you want to kind of think about it being a shelf panel here at the top facing out and an information panel here at the bottom on the back of the package. So think about it like that. And what this label does, and if we look at each one, actually shows 3 different products going to 4 different states. And as you're watching these labels go through on the screen, you're going to notice that there are changes that are happening on the label. We have some changes happening down here in the info panel, obvious changes happening up here with the universal symbol, state to state. We have changes happening in the middle, name information, the ingredients, the symbols, everything here is driven by variable data. So how do we do this? This is, you might see this on the shelf next to any one of the products in a retail establishment. So in BarTender, this is what it looks like. And it looks like there's an awful lot going on because, well, frankly, there is. There's a huge number of layers. There's a lot of variable data being pulled in from the database. But then under the hood in each one of these objects is actually a lot more going on. So how do we accomplish this? How do we get from a blank label here to this? The first thing we're going to want to do with something like this is we actually want to pull our data in, right? You've got products, you have pharmacological information, you have retailer and processor information. All of that is going to be in a database somewhere, and you're going to want to pull that in and so that you can put it on your label. First thing we do is connect to our database. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to be using Microsoft Excel. And while it's not a true database, it's a great place to start. A true database being like Access or SQL. Most people are familiar with Excel, and so it's a wonderful place to start and get used to how variable data works for BarTender. So we're just going to select our sheet here, our products XLSX. We're going to let BarTender handle automatic field type detection. We only have one sheet. Everything's in rows. We're only going to use the one sheet, and I'm finished. And that's it. That's how easy it is to connect your data to BarTender. Now, once we have this, we want to double check and make sure that we can actually see the record information in our record browser, which we can. So with that confirmation, what that allows us to do, and one of the reasons why you want to have this done first, is because you now have your access to the database fields over here in your data sources toolbox drawer. And that allows you to just sort of drag and drop information onto the label. If I had the layer visible, you can just drag and drop information directly from the database right onto the label, and you can start using that. That's important because some of your variable data is going to be longer than other pieces of data, and if you can see the live data in your label as you're designing it, then you know how much space, how much label real estate you can grant that specific piece of data, and we'll get into a little bit more why that's important a little bit later. So variable data, obviously, if we were to, kind of roll through the records here, you can see that it changes. As we're going through, it changes the value on the label. And that's fine, that's great, but that's not all we need to do. We can cycle through here and we can see all this record information change as well. But let's say, for example, if we go back to our printed labels, we can take a look down here at this little guy right here. He's a little inconspicuous, but there's a very important piece of variable data manipulation going on in that little piece of label real estate. And if you watch closely, it goes from 1 cookie for a serving size to 10 milligrams of THC to 5 milligrams of THC. That's going to be important. Not all of your products are going to necessarily need the same measurement, and so we want to be able to switch between the two. In our workbench view here, we can see kind of how this is built out. We've got a database field, and we have 2 embedded data sources. These are just data sources that live directly in the label. So right now, you see everything, right? You can see the actual 5, which is coming from the database, but then you can also see that it's THC and cookie. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut that out, add a new database, or a new data source rather. And we're just going to pop that right in there. So now we have the database field with a value and 2 labels, we'll say, two measurements. How do we get them to switch between the 2? We use what's known as a transform. The transforms do just that. They take your data and they transform it to your whim. And one of those types is a suppression. Suppression is basically saying, I want you to show or not show this very specific piece of data under a certain condition. So for milligrams of THC, we're going to use our suppression, and we're going to suppress when a specific data source meets a condition. And the specific data source we want is going to be the type, the product type. It's not the serving size. We want to look at the product type. So the product type is whether it's a cookie, a candy, or a mint in this case. And we're going to say that the product type equals cookies. So when product type is equal to cookies, the THC milligrams is not going to show. And for the cookie, we want to do the same thing. We want to suppress when product type is not equal to cookies. And as you can see, once we created the proper suppression, we're on a record right now that is not cookies, and so therefore milligrams of THC is going to show. If we go back to cookies, now all of a sudden, it's no longer milligrams of THC, it's cookies. So you have the ability to manipulate your data and display only what you want to show on that very specific label. It gives you flexibility and power and speed. So one of the other things that we're going to see here is that there's a lot of layers. You notice that there's layers. Onions have layers, ogres have layers. Well, BarTender has layers too. And it's a great way to organize the information on your label. And lots of design software has layers, but what's different about BarTender is that you can choose when to show a specific label. For me, when I was designing this label, the symbols makes it easy to organize my graphics, but also, more importantly, down here at the bottom, you can see that this record is very different. If we go back to our printout, this looks very different from what you see over here, okay? We've literally used the layer to reorganize the entire layout of that info panel on the back of the product. If we can go forward here a little bit, right, there we go. So we can see here between Colorado and Massachusetts, we've reorganized that real estate because Massachusetts has a much bigger warning that needs to be on the label. Colorado has a much shorter warning that needs to be on the label, and so therefore we can reclaim some of this real estate for some self-promotion. But with Massachusetts, and then of course California needs to be all capital letters. That's a huge warning, and you have to make sure that it's all there. But if it doesn't need to be, maybe you can reclaim some of that and use it for self-promotion. So how do we achieve that? Well, that's really easy. All we really need is a couple of layers. I'll turn this one off and turn these on. Well, that's ugly, right? We're seeing both layers at the same time. And what we don't want to print that. Nobody be able to read anything. Well, at least you'd be able to read part of it. But what we really want to do is we only want to show certain layers when certain conditions are being met. So we can right click on our layer, go to properties, and we can say our print options here. Print visibility, when do we want to print it? Right now it's set to print it always. But what we really want to do is we want to look at some data in the database and say, only print this layer when these conditions are met. So we have a record column in our database called state, and it's just like we used in suppression. So we're going to print this layer, the layer here, which is off to the side as opposed to the big long one here. We're going to say when this is equal to, let's see, Washington. Well, that's only one. We actually need to use it for Washington or Colorado because they both have short warnings. So we can use an expression. We want to say when it's Washington or when it's Colorado. So we select our state here, when it equals, and then Washington, or when state equals Colorado. And so what that does is say, hey, when the state field equals Washington, or when the state field equals Colorado, you can print this label, or you can print this layer. Likewise, if we go to this layer, we can do exactly the same thing, but for the other two states in our database. We say state, whoops, go here, state equals California, or when state equals Massachusetts. And in that way, we are flipping between the two layers. They both display exactly the same data. So if you watch this, I know it's a little ugly, but we can see that they both show the same information. But if we were to show all of this information in this orientation, it would go straight off the label, especially with California's. California is so big, it needs all that extra space. We have to reorganize, and conditionally printing your layers allows you to do that. One of the other things that we can do here is we can get data that doesn't exist in your database. For example, our net weight in grams and ounces can be produced without actually having that information already in the database. We have information in the database that gives us the ability to make that data exist. Let me explain. If we go to our workbench, turn these off, and open up, we're going to use our Vbscript editor. Vbscript is just that. It is a script language. VB stands for Visual Basic. It's a little bit of an older technology, but it gives you the ability to do things that you ordinarily would not be able to do using the tools that currently exist in BarTender natively, aka very custom solutions to fit your very specific needs. In this case, we don't want to have to write up how much each package weighs in the database, because tracking that amount of data and then fixing that amount of data later if changes are made to the what's going into the package, that can be very time consuming. Let's say, for example, if you start right now, our cookie package includes 4 cookies. Well, what if later we're optimizing and we drop it to 3 cookies? Nobody wants to have to go back through their database and fix all of those values. We can do it right here in BarTender. How do we do that? Well, let's pop the hood, double click on the object, and we can see that we have 4 data sources here. They are all embedded data, which is that blue icon. So we're not actually even pulling data from the database with the data source. We're going to have the Vbscript pull the data from the database instead. The first one here is just, it's a label, net weight, space, hyphen, space. And then the next one is going to be our total number of grams for the package. And I've left myself a little note here, it says to name me. Why? Because this data source needs a name. If you don't name the data source, there's no way for the Vbscript to know which one needs to receive the data. So we're going to go ahead and call this guy. I'm going to give it a name. We're going to say net weight in grams, okay? Shorthand. And so now this data source has a name, and when we go to our Vbscript editor, that can be called by the script by name to receive data. And we don't have to worry about what's in here because the embedded data is going to be replaced by the data caused by the script. The next one is another embedded data, just a little for grams and a slash to separate the 2 pieces of information. And then I've left myself another little note here where the number of ounces per grams is here, because we're going to need that for a calculation. So this one is going to be ounces, right? Net weight in ounces. So we're going to name this one as well. Net weight ounces. Say okay. So now this data source has a name and this data source has a name. Well, that's great. They have names. Now we know how to call them. We go to our transforms again, and we're not going to use suppression this time. We're going to use Vbscript, Visual Basic Script. Now, full disclosure, I cannot write Vbscript from scratch. I do not have that skill. However, BarTender has the ability to grant you some power in this space anyway with the Visual Basic Script Editor. If you do know how to write Visual Basic Script, this is going to give you all sorts of power and control over your data. It's important not to go too far because, again, as I said before, if you have a need and BarTender fills that need with a built-in tool, it's best to use that built-in tool for a number of reasons. 1, because we can help you if you have a problem with it. But 2, if, say, for example, the person who built the label leaves the company and the next person coming in doesn't know Vbscript, well, that could cause some challenges. But if you don't know how to use Vbscript, I'm going to show you exactly how easy it is to use the script editor to get some simple calculations completed. So the first thing we want to do is we want to say what we're trying to accomplish. We want to say that we have a named data source called net weight grams. So we're going to say double click there and it inserts the script portion for that value. So we want to say that the net weight in grams, we go to our operators, is equal to, double click. We're going to go to our database field. What is the net weight in grams equal to? It is equal to the servings per container. In other words, how many pieces are actually in the container, and the piece weight in grams. So each piece in the product container has a weight, and we're going to multiply that piece weight by the servings per container. So we're going to say multiply. So it's servings per container times the piece weight in grams. We're going to say close. It's going to say, hey, we didn't read a value because we haven't given it anything yet. We're going to ignore that. That's fine. And as you can see now, it's no longer showing the value that I placed in here. It has calculated that there is 100 grams total in this package. And I didn't even have to write a single piece of Vbscript. Let's take it a step further. So now we know how many total grams there are. We need to know how many ounces that is. And glad that I left myself this note because I would never have remembered this value. And we're just going to Control-C to copy that, go to our transforms, Vbscript, open it up. And this named data source is our net weight in ounces. So we want to say that the net weight in ounces is equal to our other named data source, our net weight in grams, times, and then the value. Because there are 0.035274 ounces per gram, as everyone knows, obviously. So we're going to go ahead and close this up. It's going to say, hey, we don't have a value yet because the script hasn't run. And we're going to ignore that. We're going to say, oh, look, we have 3.5274 ounces. Well, I don't know how many retail packages you've looked at today, but all the ones I've seen do not show that number of decimal places. So we're going to use another transform to clean this up. We're going to say that we have a number of characters that we want to stick to. So we're going to go to our transform properties for number of characters, and we're going to set a limit of maximum number of characters. Now it defaulted to 3, which is exactly what we need because we have 3 characters. We want a full ounce, the dot, the decimal point, which is a character, and then 1/10 of an ounce. And in that way, what we've done is we've effectively created data that did not exist in our database or anywhere else on our label, but we had the building blocks of that data to put it together. And we've allowed BarTender to create that total net weight in grams and in ounces without ever having to worry about, putting it in a database. You can get real fancy with it. If you look at, for example, whoops, let's turn that back on. One of the things, like if we talk about suppression, look how many data sources we have here. It looks big and bad and scary, but really all we're doing is we're letting BarTender concatenate this data. We've said we have a database field here, 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 and here, and here, but each of these is also being conditionally printed using suppression. So we're pulling all of the data in, and then only under certain conditions do we say, show the total THC, show the total CBD, and then label it as THC or CBD as appropriate. The last thing I wanted to show you guys is, well, if we look at our workbench, man, there's a lot of cool data going on in here. Look at it all. It's amazing. But you know what it's not? It's not pretty. It doesn't look like something you want to put on the shelf. It doesn't look like something I'd want to put on a product. But it has the information we need, so we want to make it look nice. Everything you see here, with the exception of the universal symbols, was created in BarTender using our advanced color and shape and text options. For example, the Blue Buddha logo here simply uses a curve up text object, duplicated and aligned, a star shape, and a moon shape. This is a 7-sided polygon because I needed the crest across the top and then the flat at the bottom. And then the frames here are simply curved in concave edge squares. There are 4 copies. There's 1 here, 2 here, and 1 down here. They have different fills, different line thicknesses, and different colors. And a word on color, I've got this layer down here to never print because this is sort of my palette. This contains some experiments and some things that didn't quite work for the label. But most importantly is we have this guy right back here. This is my color palette. This is a luxury color palette. And I used this to color all of the other options. So if we were to go into this, you can see that it's just an image. But if we were to select, say, one of our frame pieces, we can go to our box and select a color. And we can go right down here to our palette, and we can see we have white, dark slate gray, dark khaki, Peru, or dark slate gray again. And we can change that anytime we want. And that allows you to stay on brand. So if you have your color palette, it's a very specific color palette for your brand. You just pull one of these little guys in here, and you don't have to worry about entering color values. You just eyedrop it. You know that the name is correct, and you're good to go. And that is how you achieve this label. Back to you, Stacy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. Really do appreciate it. So yeah, we've reached the end of our presentation, and Now we have a little bit of time left before we leave you all today for a Q&A. So if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and submit your questions. And again, if we don't get to them today in the time we have left, don't worry, to them via email after the presentation. But before we get started on that, I wanted to share the results of the polls with y'all. So the first question we had, what's the legality of cannabis in your country or state? And majority said both adult use and medical cannabis are legal. So, yeah. And then for our second poll result, how does your business serve the cannabis industry? 78% said, I am a technology provider. That's awesome. Glad to have you all on with us today. So yeah. All right. And so next we're going to go into our Q&A. Awesome. So I'm going to pull up the questions here. And the first question we have is, if I need to make a last minute change to some of the data I need to print, does it have to be changed in the database before printing, or can BarTender override the database in an emergency?
I can take that.
Awesome.
So the answer is yes, BarTender can override the database information. It would require the use of a data entry form, which is something we didn't look at today, but it's very easy to set up. It would have to be set up before you go to print. But say, for example, you've got your data collected and in your database, and then suddenly, just as you're getting to print, somebody sends you a stop press email and says, hey, this value here is not correct. We need to maybe ship it someplace else, or the pharmacological data that we put in for this particular product for CBD is wrong. We have to correct that. So what you can do is set up your data entry form and link it to that database field wherever that's showing up on your label. And if you don't enter something in the data entry form, it will skip that data and won't show it. It'll just pull from the database. But if you do enter something in that box, it will override what's in that field in the database and show what you entered instead. So it is effectively an override to the data that you have pulling in from the database. And depending on how you have that set up, you can select different types of data per record even to replace as necessary.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So we are running short on time. We just have a few minutes left. So we'll only have time to take one more question live. But if you haven't done so already, please submit your questions. We will answer them via email after the webinar. So the last question we have is there a way to see labels we've printed in the past in case we have a traceability situation?
Yes, you can. So BarTender, the BarTender suite has a function called the BarTender System Database. BarTender System Database effectively allows you to record anything, virtually anything and everything that happens within the BarTender suite. Who's printing what, where it was printed to, what was printed, when it was printed, all of that stuff gets recorded. You have the ability to control how much you want to use or if you want to use it at all. It's incredibly useful for things just like that. So if somebody comes and knocks on your door and says, hey, we need to audit your operation, we need to see all of this stuff that you printed from January to March, you can use the BarTender System Database to pull all of that up, including pictures of the labels that you printed, that each individual label that printed. You could also use it for things like your workflow. So if you have like a label revision process that you're going through, to control the quality control and things like that with our librarian program, History Explorer and Reprint Console. So if you need to reprint an entire batch of labels, yeah, you can just pull that right up and say go, and you've got a whole new batch of the same exact label job. So yes, you can pull that back up.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen. And we are out of time. So if you haven't done so already, go ahead and quickly submit that question. Again, if we didn't get to it today, no worries. During the presentation, we will follow up with you via email. And also in that email, we will be sending out the recording and access to the presentation that you saw today. I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who joined us. This was a great discussion, and I want to say a huge thank you to Elizabeth and Stephen for being our hosts today. Thank you all so much, and have a great one.
Thank you.